So, good evening. We're going to have a presentation on bees and pollination by Zack Koopman. My name is Chelsea Martins. I'm the Marshall County Master Gardener Coordinator, and I do all the gardening needs here for Marshall County. So, whenever you're ready, Zack, go ahead.
All righty. Let's see here, sorry. So, like she said, I'm Zack Koopman. I work here at Iowa State. My position at Iowa State actually has nothing to do with bees. However, it's I guess more than a passion of mine. I've been doing it for a long number of years. How many years have I been doing it? I've been doing it for about 8 years now. As you can see, I have completed the Master Beekeeping Program, which is given by the University of Montana. That's a 3-year program that you have to do. So it involves you have to do some writings, you have to do a research experiment, you have to do all sorts of trainings, lots of tests, all that good stuff that really test your knowledge, see what you really know and what you think you know. As you can see, oftentimes when I'm doing beekeeping, I have 3 little helpers, and I use the word helper in a lot of jest. They help a lot, they think they are, but they're always there. Pretty much I always say that if you can beekeep with a 3-year-old at hand, then you can pretty much do it anytime. Just makes for a really interesting experience. One of the good things is they certainly don't have a fear of bees that most little kids would have. The unfortunate thing is that they have no fear of bees, so they don't back off when they're supposed to, and they aren't reading all the signs. Obviously, number 3 there, she's not quite 2 yet. The only reason she doesn't have a bee suit yet is because they don't make one that small. So when she gets bigger, she'll be able to get in there with us. Until then, I guess I just have 2 helpers when we're doing the actual bees. Moving over to the right side of the screen, we have, I had the fortunate experience to be able to travel down to Nicaragua this past winter. There's a group out of Wisconsin known as the Nicaragua Bee Project. They're a group of beekeepers there. And what they do is it's a charity. You know, it's not uncommon for Nicaragua to be a hub for charities to attend. One of the downsides to it is oftentimes what these charities will do is they'll come in, drop off a bunch of information, drop off a bunch of equipment, and then leave. That doesn't help these people a whole lot because then you just see it just kind of deteriorate after that quickly. But what's really nice about this project is basically you have to kind of do an apprenticeship type of deal. So you have to work with bees for a year. Then the project gives you a full setup, hive, all the equipment, all the bees, all that good stuff, and then you're on your own. But you have a year under your belt. You have a mentor to be able to talk to all the time. And then it's kind of expected that you'll take on someone to help out too. As you can see there, you know, they range in all ages. That's a little kid there in the yellow suit. And one of the things you have to kind of keep in mind too is our bees here are very gentle. That kid is holding a frame with Africanized bees on it. And obviously he has no fear either. They are super aggressive there. We were going to go to one of our sites, and they were really kind of curious as to how much experience we really had, because the bees had gotten angry and had killed a horse the day before, and they were just kind of curious if they really wanted to send a group of Americans in there. But so it's just a wide experience whenever you go down there. So that's a great project if you ever want to look up some more information on that. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick overview of me and my beekeeping history. Yeah, so we'll move on to the actual bees. So obviously beekeeping is not really a new thing. Bees are not a new thing. As you can see upper left-hand corner of your screen there, bees are one of only 11 species that are alive today that were at the dinosaur time. And that's really remarkable to think about, because not only are there only 11, but of those, 7 of those live underwater. So it is very rare to have something like that. And so they've obviously evolved with our plants and our environment very simultaneously. you know, bees have been an important part of our culture as far as we can remember. The first, if you think about it, you know, it is important because, you know, that was your only sweetener up until when sugarcane showed up. So there are cave drawings going back to 8,000 BCs in Spain, where they're showing people harvesting bees or honey from wild hives. And people did not start keeping bees as far as managing bees until about 3000 BC. And that's down there with the Egyptians. It just kind of goes to show like how long we've been holding on to bees, how important they have been, how much they have really spread across our world. Okay, so bees in Iowa. Does bees have Iowa, or does Iowa have bees? What do you think? Nods, yes or no? Yep. Yeah, bees. Iowa is a huge honey producer. So the picture you have up there are all the registered beehives within the state of Iowa, are sites. So some of these sites will have one hive on them and some might have 200 or 300 hives on them. So it just kind of depends on exactly who we're talking about. And this picture here is only registered beehives, and not everybody chooses to register their hives. Beekeeping is kind of one of those unique endeavors where there's a lot going on with it, but no one really knows exactly how many people are out there doing it, how many hives are out there in Iowa, since you're not forced to register your hives. But you know, the big thing is beekeeping has really seen a huge surge of popularity here in the last several years. You know, if you just go back 20 years, they had the Iowa honey producers held their annual conference there in Marshalltown, and they had to have at least 75 people catered in order to have a caterer show up at the venue. And basically the honey producers just bought about 40 of those because they could only get 30, 40 people to even show up. Now we keep running out of spaces that are big enough to hold us because we'll hold several hundred. So it's just amazing how it has really ballooned. And I think that just shows how people are seeing how pollinators are so important to our environment. And it's more than just a hobby that gives off some sweet nectar at the end. Which leads me to my next one. So a lot of times when we talk about pollinators and we talk about plants for pollinators, we always talk about native species. So what do you think? Are honeybees native to Iowa? No, maybe. Are they native to the United States? No, they're not. They're completely not. So they were completely brought here. So when I talk about bees, I'm talking about Apis mellifera. That's what we call the honeybee. They are not native to the United States or North America whatsoever. They were brought here by colonies, the colonists, which just shows how important they were, because when they sent requests back to the United States, or back to England and the rest of the continental Europe, that was always on the list, is to send more colonies because they needed those colonies there. And you could see it was a progression that they moved across the United States west, you know, because the Native Americans had never seen this creature before. You know, they'd seen other bees, of course, but they were always known as the white man's fly, which gave the Native Americans a few years head start as to when they would be kind of showing up. So they kind of made their own natural progression across the United States west on their own up until the Rocky Mountains. They just couldn't get past that, so someone had to take them over. But you know, what we know is the honeybee is not native to the United States whatsoever. Depending on who you ask, they're either native to Asia, which is the most popular way, but there's some new research out there saying that they come from Northern Africa as well. But again, they've been throughout Europe for a long time because they just didn't have those natural barriers of, you know, an ocean to have to cross. And people have just moved them around because they've just been that important. So North America itself has over 4,000 species of bees. So when we talk about bees, there's a lot of them out there. Iowa itself only has about 300 to 400 species, but you think about how many different species that is. And pollinators are more important than ever. And this past year, 2019, was the first year that an insect has made the endangered species list from the continental United States. There's been a few that were native to Hawaii, or have their populations on Hawaii have been threatened, but this is the first time that a continental insect has been, and it's the rusty back bumblebee, and that is native to Iowa as well. So we're just seeing lots of different stressors on insects and our pollinators, okay? So like I said, for the purpose of this, we're going to be mainly talking about the honeybee. Of course, all bees are important, but the honeybee is really the only managed insect that anybody really uses at any kind of commercial scale. There's a few researchers that will host different colonies of wasps and bumblebees and things like that, but obviously you look around and honeybee is king, okay? So when we think about the honeybee in a hive, the general hive will have about 50,000 bees in it, okay? Within that, we have one queen, okay? Only one for the entire hive. And then we have a couple hundred males, which are known as the drones, and the rest are all female workers, okay? And what's unique about them is every single one of the workers will be a daughter or a son of that queen, okay? Her only job, the queen's only job, is to lay eggs. If you look there at the picture, her wings are very tiny compared to the rest of her body. A queen will only leave the hive once, maybe twice in her lifetime. The rest of it, she will stay within that box the entire time of her life. She's just not meant for flying. All she does, obviously she doesn't do any other work. All she does is lay eggs. That is her only purpose in life, is to lay eggs. So she can lay about 1,500 eggs every single day during the egg laying season, which is just why when we think about the numbers, we have to not think about the colonies or the bees as individuals, but we have to be thinking about them as a colony, okay? So the drones are there for one reason only. They are there to mate with queens. Now, they will not mate with a queen from their own hive. It will not happen. So there cannot be that source of inbreeding. So a beehive will produce drones or males for the only purpose to continue the species by crossbreeding with other hives, okay? So if communism could ever work, it would be within the beehive. I mean, it is completely all about the survival of the hive and the species, to the point where we are willing to put in our own resources to keep the hive next to us going, which is just amazing to think about. Like I said, the rest are all worker bees, which are also female. However, they cannot lay a fertilized egg. So if the queen dies, they don't elect a new one. They have to make a new one from an egg, okay? So that's just kind of an interesting thing. Sometimes people think that if she gets squished, well, they'll just promote somebody up, and that's just not quite how it works, okay? So some of the kind of unique items that just point out, we don't need to be memorizing this, but this is just the worker bee. And we're going to kind of get into how pollination works and how the bees kind of do this. And so we need to be looking at some of the items that are specific to the worker bee. And one would be that proboscis, which is their long tongue. And, obviously you got to get down into those the deep ends of those flowers, which, some of those flowers are pretty tiny. Those tiny straw-like tongues that they have, the proboscis, can get all the way down in there to get that nectar, which is exactly what they're after. Obviously, the stinger, we always think about the stinger. Males don't even have one. So if you ever want to mess with a bee, go ahead and pick up a male, because they cannot sting you. The queen also has a stinger, but very rarely will she ever use it. It's just, again, her instinct is not to protect herself. Someone else will do that. All she needs to worry about is laying those eggs. But if we look over, we always think of those big yellow pollen sacs on a bee's legs. That's actually part of their body. It's not just kind of clumped there. It's a special sac that they pack that in there with, that they can carry these huge amounts. We oftentimes describe it as having like a beach ball worth of weight attached to your legs and still be able to fly, which is amazing. Which kind of takes us up to their wings. You know, we think about wings flapping like a bird. Well, a worker bee, their wings work differently. They actually have 4 wings, not 2, and they work in a figure 8 configuration, which is why they're so maneuverable, and they can hop from flower to flower to flower. You know, kind of like you think of the difference between a helicopter and an airplane, just much more maneuverable, much more control. Okay. We're kind of running through this. If anybody has a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. I just want to make sure that we get them all answered. You know, we do these presentations and I kind of have an idea of what I want to talk about, but I'm sure you guys have kind of come with some questions that you want to make sure get covered. So feel free to throw in those chats. I just want to make sure we hit any questions that anybody has. Okay. You know, we talk about those wings in that figure 8 pattern, but those are still moving extremely fast, which is why they look like they aren't really moving. Those wings are beating at 230 beats per second. So think about how fast that has to move. Okay, so I show this class oftentimes when I'm teaching beekeeping classes at Extension is for people who are interested in becoming beekeepers, not just people who are interested in hearing more about it. So this is much more important if you wanted to keep bees. It's all a time frame, but yet it's an extremely helpful tool for us to think about. And it just has a lot of great information on it, okay? So if we look kind of in the middle there, that just kind of shows the progression of how a bee is actually raised and born. So again, that queen, she'll dip her abdomen in the back end or her thorax in the back of one of those cells. That's all those tiny little holes that we see in the honeycomb, okay? Each one of those is called a cell. They'll put different things in there, whether it is an egg, if it's going to be nectar, honey, pollen, that is their storage. That is what they use. You probably have never paid attention enough, but if we ever hold up a frame, all those cells are not straight up and down or straight horizontal to the world. They're actually at an angle up. So that way when they put the extremely wet nectar in there, it won't run out, right? So if it was just a flat tube, it wouldn't hold very much, but it's at a slight angle so they can really fill that up with nectar all the way to the tip. Okay, so back to the diagram showing how the queen lays her eggs. So she'll lay her egg in it, and again, she's done, right? That's it. She laid her egg, that's all that matters. And it's the other workers' jobs to sit there and they feed it, they cool it. If it's depending on the time of year, they'll make sure it's warm, whatever they need to do. Then they'll start feeding it, okay? So we think about those bees carrying all that pollen. No adult bee eats pollen, okay? Only the larvae eats the pollen. They make what they call a bee bread, and they'll feed that to the bees. And of course, they also feed them that royal jelly that we always hear so much about. Well, I don't know why they call it royal jelly, because it's actually the worker bees that make it. It's not part of the queen. Again, she just lays eggs, okay? So they'll feed it that royal jelly for so many days, depending on what it's going to grow up to be, and then they'll cap it over, okay? So everyone thinks of the monarch butterfly with the chrysalis. It's almost the exact same thing happens with a bee, only instead of hanging from a tree branch or off of a leaf, it happens in those cells, okay? So it's caterpillar or a larvae for a while. Then when it's ready, it'll spin its own cocoon inside there, and the other worker bees will cap it over with a little bit of wax, and it'll sit there and cook in there for how long it needs to go. And then it'll chew its way out, and it's a fully formed bee, ready to go. Start working immediately, okay? So that kind of takes us up to the picture ahead, or to the top. And this is one of those things where I just think it's absolutely amazing how the world has made this creature that can do this. So we think of, you know, any animal, right? They have to mate every single time they want to have a live offspring. Bees don't do that. So like I said, the queen only leaves the hive once, typically in her life, maybe twice. And that once is so she can go out and mate, okay? So as soon as she's born, she'll dry off, harden a little bit. She's still tiny compared to a full-size queen. She'll go out, she'll fly, she'll mate with 10, 15, 20 drones. Again, those are the males from all different hives. These drones will fly over 7 to 10 miles to find these queens that they have to. They'll fertilize her, and she'll take all that semen and she holds it into a special sac within her body, okay? She's not fertile forever, but she has a special sac where she'll just store that. Then as she's going from cell to cell to lay those eggs, she will make that determination whether she will fertilize it or not fertilize it. So an unfertilized egg, if we look there, that will become a drone or a male, okay? So if the hive is feeling as though they need some more drones, she'll just start laying eggs with no fertilization to them. It's just an egg, okay? If she decides, again, the vast majority of these eggs are going to become worker bees, so she'll fertilize every single one of those eggs. And at that point, a fertilized egg can be turned either into a worker bee or into a queen bee. The hive itself will determine if they need to make a new queen or not. Again, typically they're not going to do that. You know, she's just laying thousands and thousands of eggs every day. If the queen is still going good, they'll leave her alone. But again, it's kind of a harsh society. If production starts to go down and she's not cutting the mustard anymore, they'll have her lay her own replacements. They'll lay several of them, and they'll make a whole bunch of new queens, and it'll be a battle royale. They'll kill her, kick her out, and all those young queens will battle out to see who is the strongest to become the new head of the hive. So it's a pretty good gig while it lasts, but as soon as they decide you're done, it's pretty harsh life. But I just think that's absolutely amazing that, you know, that queen can sense what exactly that hive needs, and she will make the determination if she's going to fertilize that egg or not. You know, and it's just kind of interesting to look then at how long it takes to make these different divisions of bees. The drones or the males, they take the longest, but when you think about it, their only job is to possibly mate with another queen. The queen itself, she takes the least amount of time, but yet she probably has arguably the most important job. And if we think about that from an evolution standpoint, it's very important, because if we've killed our queen or she's lost or whatever happened to her, we want to crank out a new one quickly because she's the only one that can lay an egg. So if we cannot replace her, the whole hive will go down, okay? So this is why it's important. So the worker bees, yes, they can lay eggs technically, but since they can never mate, they could never lay a fertilized egg. And so that can be a problem in some of our hives. Sometimes we'll have all these ridiculous drone numbers, and that's because we'll have a laying worker. And because again, she never got mated with, so she can't lay a fertilized egg. So every egg she lays will have to become a male. So again, just one of those facts that people just don't really ever know unless you get into bees. But I just find that absolutely amazing that they can handle all that. Okay, so here's just kind of another image of the layout of, you know, what happens when you're a bee. But what we're going to do is kind of go past that egg larvae stage into the pupa, and we're going to really kind of focus on after it hatches, okay? So again, every worker has its job. They're going to be working immediately after they come out. However, their body's still not 100% developed, so they're going to do the jobs that they can handle at that time, okay? So the least strenuous job is taking care of the young, right? So they can do that immediately. They can start cleaning out the cells. They can start taking care of the other nurse bees. Then as they get older, those wax, they develop the ability to start producing some wax. That comes in. Now we can start building or changing the hive, however we need to do that. Then we're going to become a guard bee, and then our last job, if you will, our last job is actually going out and foraging, getting that nectar, getting that pollen, and bringing it back to the hive, okay? So we think of that as their sole job, but yet that's the last part of their life, okay? And so we see that takes 43 days to get up past that. The flying takes it out of their bodies. So we always say a queen bee can live 3 to 5 years, but a worker bee in the summertime only lives several weeks because that flying really takes it out of their body. Now here in Iowa this time of year, the bees that are in the hive now hopefully will be around in March because the queen has stopped laying eggs, getting ready for winter. They don't have the resources to take care of that much young. So they're just kind of focusing on who's alive there and keeping them warm. Okay. All right, so that kind of takes us to our hives. So like I said, all around the world, different people have used different styles of hives. If we look in the upper left, that's kind of like the German, European kind of style. The lower right would be like Thailand, Asia kind of style. If we think kind of back to like the stereotypical old time hives, we think of that basket skep there on the bottom left. Those were good. We used those for a very, very long time. The biggest problem was basically all you did was you grab a bunch of bees, you throw them in this basket and you leave them alone. The problem was when it comes to time to harvest, you killed all the bees that were in that hive to extract it out. So as far as a stewardship practice, that is not the way to do it. And then also at the time that they were using those, they didn't have the problems with diseases and pests. So with those skeps, you could never do a hive inspection to know how it was going until it was dead. So really these aren't management. These are just kind of holding feral hives where you want them to harvest, but it's not really a management style, okay? So the two hives that we see here in Iowa and the US would be the top right. That's what we call a longboard hive. Those aren't super popular here just because of how cold it gets. Those were developed for Africa. They're super cheap to make. And then what's really nice about them is you can look at just a very small segment of the hive at one time. And that's important in Africa because you're working with Africanized bees. So you want to work with as few bees as possible while still getting a good look at what you're doing. But the ones we use here in Iowa and the vast majority around the United States and the vast majority of Europe is going to be the middle bottom one. That's the Langstroth hive. So that's just kind of the gold standard of beekeeping in the Western world, I would say. So this is just kind of a blow up of it. So Langstroth really changed the course of beekeeping when he developed this. He came up with this in about 1858. And it hasn't really changed since. So that's how well this hive has worked. And what just really kind of changed it was this idea of bee space. So that's the amount of space. If you get too close, they won't. It's 3/5 of an inch. If you build it too close, they won't build out that comb the way they need to. And if you space it out too far away, they'll try narrowing that space and just makes a mess. Bee space, when we think of those frames, if we have it all sized correctly, we can pull out those frames and do a nice inspection. Everything is clean and handles everything very nicely. You can do a really great job of inspecting and harvesting. And this is, like I said, this is when we really change from just kind of having bees on the side and just destroying colonies to really changing to a stewardship management style of beekeeping, okay? And what's interesting is, Langstroth, we would imagine him to be some kind of intellectual, some kind of entomology PhD or something like that. No, he was actually a pastor who then became head of a women's college. And at that time, beekeeping was a method to handle stress. It was thought to be that the buzzing would calm you and calm your nerves, which I guess if you run a women's college might be something that you would need to have. But this idea of these frames is really what changed the world of beekeeping forever. So if we look here at the blow up of it, the big things to just kind of notice are the two bigger boxes at the bottom. That's where they actually live. We call that the brood area. So that's where they're going to be raising their babies. That's where they're going to be laying their eggs, all that kind of stuff. They put some honey, but not a lot of honey there. After we get past that point, then these smaller boxes at the top, which we call honey supers, that's where they will really pack the honey away. Okay, so I oftentimes kind of say that the honey they keep in the bottom area is kind of like the freezer above your refrigerator, and the honey supers at the top is the deep freeze in the basement. Okay, times are plentiful. Something went on sale at Fairway. We're going to buy a lot of it, and we'll eat it whenever we get the chance. Okay, so that's just really where they're putting that up there. And obviously, we as beekeepers, we want them to put only honey there because it makes a nice, clean product to be able to harvest and take to market. Okay. So we'll just talk a little bit about some of the common tools and things that we use as beekeepers. So obviously the bee suit is one of the most iconic things that everyone has seen. You know, they range in all sorts of different styles. Some will be the full zip ups like we see these people wearing with the full veils, headdress. But some people will just wear a coat. Some people won't wear anything. You know, the story I always like to talk about with not wearing a bee suit. I was at a presentation one time, and the gentleman giving the talk was doing how to do a hive inspection, and he's wearing flip-flops, shorts, and a tank top. He's getting ready to open up these bees, and someone says, "Don't you want to put on some protection?" He goes, "Yeah, great idea." And he puts down his sunglasses, and he called that good, which I guess good for him. But you can see, you know, there that's a donkey or a mule that's wearing that bee suit. Again, my kids have bee suits, so they make them for kids, donkeys, dogs, whatever. You know, the donkey one is actually pretty practical because if you're going into a super Africanized area and you have to be pulling out honey supers or whatever, you know, like I said, down in Nicaragua, the bees got all stirred up and they killed the horse. Okay, so we got to protect everybody. Again, bee suits are not sting proof. They just kind of help with it. You know, so if we think about, you know, the stinger, you know, it goes into your skin. All we're doing is adding a little bit more distance that it has to travel before it gets to you. So there's nothing really special about a bee suit. You could wear your winter coat if you wanted to, other than the fact that it'd be super hot, right? It's just an extra layer of protection to try to absorb those stings versus get all the way to your skin. Okay, on the upper right, we call those hive tools. Every single beekeeper is going to have a hive tool in their pocket whenever they're cracking open a hive. You use them all the time. You know, we think about that these lids are just going to pop off. Well, again, bees don't realize that they're there for us. They just kind of use the hive as their home. So they will glue all those holes up, you know, just kind of like sealing up your house. But they use a glue made from sap, which we call propolis. So we have to actually crack those babies open, scrape all that stuff off all the time. So a beekeeper will always have some form of hive tool in their pocket anytime they're beekeeping, always. And then the other iconic piece of equipment that every beekeeper pretty much uses is a smoker, right? So we think of smoke as calming bees. And I always kind of say, well, that's not exactly how that works. You know, in my beekeeping classes, I say, well, what if I puff this smoke right here in your face? Would that calm you down? Well, no, not really. So what the smoke really does is it throws off a warning, right? So I always like to describe it as, you know, you're sitting there in your living room, all of a sudden the smoke alarm goes off, right? Everyone goes to attention. What is going on? Okay. So that's that first initial puff. Then the kind of panic will kind of start in the hive. Something's going on. Let's figure out what it is. You know, everyone prepares to get out of the house, right? So not that you should ever do this in a true fire emergency, but most people will gather up their most prized possessions that they could possibly grab to carry out if you have to leave your house, right? So a bee does the exact same thing. But the only thing that the only commodity that they have that they can actually store with them or carry with them is honey. So that's what they'll do. They'll sit there and they'll put their heads into all those cells and they'll suck up as much honey as they possibly can. Okay, well at this point, all right, something's going up. We're all full of honey. We're packed up. We're ready to leave, but the queen's not giving the signal that we actually have to leave. So we just wait. And that's where we as beekeepers can start working with them, okay? Because if you're full, you're fat, you're full of honey, you're just not that ready to fight, right? So they're just kind of calm. So that's why, you know, thinking that the smoke really calms them, it does to a certain point, But if there's bees flying around your head and you try puffing them, they'll never calm down, right? Because it's not, what we're trying to do is get them to fill up on that honey and just kind of calm them down, get them into that calm environment, okay? So those are the basic tools that we have. All right, so let's talk about pollination a little bit, okay? So we oftentimes think about, the busy bee, right? The busy bee is going to do all this great pollination for us. However, the bees don't care about pollination. That's not their goal. That's not what they're doing. It's just kind of a habit, it just kind of happens because what they're really after is the nectar and some pollen for themselves, okay? So the worker bee, this is a really simple cartoon, but the worker bee goes in to either harvest some nectar or harvest some pollen to take home back to the hive, and then they'll go to the next hive. Well, they don't drop off purposely pollen from one to the next. That cross-pollination really comes from the pollen that's stuck to their hair or to the legs that are not in those pollen sacs, or while they're stuffing it in, some will overflow. Okay, so that's really how we get that cross-pollination. So yes, it's very important, but they're not as helpful as some people will say that they are. They provide a really important service to us, obviously. So if we look, and this kind of gives a key. I know a lot of people here are master gardeners, so we'll talk about planting for these here in a little bit. But something to kind of think about is the flowers that really need pollination oftentimes will have what we call a complete flower, okay, where the male and the female are together, okay? So if we think about Iowa and our landscape, soybeans, for instance, have a complete flower, okay? So the entire flower is right there. They need some kind of cross-pollination to get maximum yield, whether that is through wind or pollinators. Honeybees have been shown to really boost up soybean yields. The problem, if you'll say problem, is that the flowers on soybeans just don't last very long. So if we stuck a hive right in the middle of a soybean field, bees are lazy, so they'll do kind of a small radius. If they don't have to go from flower to flower to flower, then they'll go as short a distance as they possibly can. So the beans right next to that hive do get that major boost, but then by the time you get out to any kind of size, you just don't see the yield boost. So that's the complete flower. If we look at our incomplete flowers like corn, where the male is at the top and the female is at the bottom, bees just don't really pay attention to it because the plant just doesn't need a pollinator to help. It just doesn't help. So they're not integrated to each other. Okay, so this is just kind of a, if you will, a soapbox slide. It just kind of really shows the importance of bees and the foods that we like to eat that a pollinator is responsible for. Again, other pollinators can get this pollination done. However, honeybees are the only managed pollinator that we use. So that's why they're so important, because we think of like the almond orchards out in California. Well, no one brings in 30,000 nests of bumblebees or hummingbirds or whatever. We bring in tons and tons of hives, okay? And that's just because that's something we can manage and that's something we can move around easily, all that. So, basically what they're showing, like in the food market there, is the one at the top is the grocery store that everybody wants to go to. The one at the bottom shows what would not be available to you anymore. So a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, so some don't. Potatoes don't need to have a pollinator, so they're still on that list. Again, I said corn's still on that list. So we can still have sweet corn, but you're not going to have any tomatoes to go with it next summer. All that kind of stuff. And then the one on the right just kind of shows more like the processed items. What would you give up? Sure, you can still have your chips, but we're not going to have guacamole or salsa to go with at the restaurant. Okay, just a fun little thing to look at. And basically what we say is 1 out of every 3 bites that you take is because of a honeybee or another pollinator to get it to you. Okay, so they're very important. So this is just, your pollinator garden, what are kind of the key things? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, exactly what plants work and what plants don't work, because I know a lot of you guys are master gardeners, and so I'm not going to preach to the choir on this one. The big deal to really kind of be thinking about with this is providing a nectar source for the entire season. Okay, so like I said, I oftentimes talk about this in my beginning beekeeper classes, where we need to be able to provide them food the entire season. So sometimes people say, hey, I got 2 apple trees, I should probably get a hive of bees, right? Well, yeah, that's great, but what else are they going to eat, right? So when we're planting these gardens for a pollinator habitat, it's something that's going to grow or be blooming all season long. So, like CRP, there's all different kinds of programs with that. The pollinator program was a really big deal several years ago. And one of the key things with that was you had to have something flowering all 3 different stages of the summer, right? So early spring, summer, and all the way through fall. This is something that we can really see. So I keep bees in 3 different locations, actually. One's in my backyard right in town. And it is amazing. That hive will always, always outperform anything else. And the biggest reason I attribute to that is because people in our neighborhood will have flowers out as soon as Lowe's will sell them, and they will have them all the way through, right? And they'll be covering up those flowers. And so that just provides some food for a lot longer time. Okay. So let's talk about how the bees actually kind of make honey. It's kind of seems like this big mystery, right? I mean, we know they go out and they collect nectar, but then how does it actually become honey? So again, this is just a real simple slide, but it packs a lot of information on it. So yes, the worker bees go out and visit flowers. They bring in that nectar. That nectar is then taken back to the hive. The bees actually have a special stomach within their body that they suck that into. When they get back to the hive, they regurgitate it into all those different cells. Well, that's really wet, okay? So nectar is very wet, and honey has to be dried in order to stay good, okay? So that's what they do. They ripen that honey. So that natural process of regurgitating it out will put the different enzymes in that can add to the flavor of honey, and then they sit there and they ripen it, okay? So they beat their wings, and they use their proboscis as like a spoon, and so they're stirring it up constantly, and they're beating it off, so that way they are getting that moisture out like a dehumidifier, pushing that out. And this is another one of those fascinating things. So they sit there and they dry it out, and when it hits 18.5%, that is when honey will stay good, okay? And how a bee knows when nectar has become 18.5%, I don't know. But when it does, they'll cap it over with a little seal of wax, and boom, they're done with it. They'll walk away, okay? And as long as they harvest or do that down to that 18.5%, honey never goes bad, okay? So we think about buying a bear in the grocery store, and it gets grainy and gross. Well, that honey is not bad. It is just crystallized. So you just put in a warm bottle of water, and it'll melt right back down to you. You're good to go, okay? So just some things to be thinking about, though. Bees have to visit on average 2 million flowers to get 1 pound of honey. And it takes about 50,000 miles of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I mean, that's just amazing to think about for every single pound of honey. And here in Iowa, our average hives produce about 65 pounds of honey. So you think about how many flowers, how many trips back and forth that takes, and how much extra work that is, because in a bee's lifetime, they only will consume about 1/16 of a teaspoon. So you think about those numbers, and in their lifetime, they'll only produce about 1/12 of a teaspoon. So not too much more. So that's why it takes so many bees to produce all that honey. Okay, so this is just a real simplified slide as to how we harvest honey off. So the guy's sitting there holding that frame, and that's a nice cap. So all those white cappings on there, you can see by his finger, there's some empty holes. So those aren't capped over, but the rest of them look like a nice smooth surface. And those are the capped over cells. So that's good ripe honey. The bees have dried that down to 18.5%, and it's ready to be harvested. Okay, so basically all we're doing, you can see in the upper left, is obviously we're going to get the bees off the hive or off the frames and take them back to our honey house or wherever we're extracting. Then we're going to cut all those little cappings off somehow, right? Because there are all these little tubes, so somehow we have to get it out. So that's what we're going to do, either with a hot knife or a hole punch, something like that, to open up all those different cells. Then we put it through a simple centrifuge, so like a salad spinner type of deal, and just spin that out at a really fast speed, and it just flings that honey to the outsides of the walls where it'll drip down. So the kind of rule of thumb is you always harvest honey on the hottest day of the year. That way the honey flows faster and everything just goes that much quicker. Okay, then basically you're just going to filter that out somehow, because you're going to have parts of bees or bits of wax or whatever, and nobody really wants to eat that. So that's just the quick. So here's just kind of a quick conversion chart. You know, I don't know about anybody else on this call, but I very much enjoy sweets, obviously. And there's a real simple conversion there if you ever want to use honey instead of regular table sugar. And as a honey producer myself, go ahead and do that. So that way we uptick the demand a little bit here. But it's a straight conversion right there, as you can see. Honey is a lot sweeter to your tongue, so you're going to use less of it, which is probably a good thing. You know, if we think about the statistics here in the US, the average American eats about 152 pounds of sugar every year, but yet we only consume about 1.3 pounds of honey. So like I said, as a honey producer, let's turn that around the other direction, okay? Let's uptick that demand for us. But that is just a real handy little conversion you can look up. It tells you exactly how you can turn any regular recipe that you like to use into one that uses honey, okay? Several of my customers, I sell, honey, I'll sell by the 5-gallon bucket, and it just amazes me how many people will buy that, because I mean, that's a lot of honey, right? I mean, who eats that much honey in a year? And so I'll ask them, what are you going to do with all this honey? Well, we don't eat any refined sugar. We convert everything, and we use as much honey as we possibly can. So can be done. Lots of people do it. Just something to think about, okay? So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I just kind of wanted to show a few other just kind of fun slides. So what's really interesting here in this picture is just another use of bees that we don't really think about. So again, if you can see, there's those long hives that we kind of talked about. And again, those are really used in Africa. So why are these hives lined up in this row like this? Is it just convenient or what? Well, what they're really doing is they're using it as a fence, right? So if you live in Africa, a lot of people will still live on these preserves where it's illegal to hunt elephants. So they have to kind of live in harmony with each other if they can. Well, I mean, look at that fence, and that elephant can go right through that fence. So if an elephant's going through your fence and you can't harm it or scare it too much, and it's going through your fence towards your crop that your family has to eat off of for the rest of the year, well, that's what they did. They made their own kind of fence. They have shown that if an elephant bumps into one of these, again, these are Africanized bees, so they're super aggressive. It'll attack that elephant, and those elephants remember that. And we're not going to cross that fence. That's not worth crossing. However, this one, sure, we can go right through that. We won't even know it's there. So just another fun little thing that we can see. And then lastly, here's just another one. Again, we've been using bees for as long as bees and people have been together. Basically what they did here was they put their hives in the wall. So that way, if you tried climbing the wall, you're going to climb over the bees. So how bad do you really want to get over that wall? And then the catapult, it has been shown that people will that they use to catapult beehives into a fort or whatever, and that just drive people out, okay? So I had a question on cost of honey. It just kind of depends on who you are and how much honey you're doing. But basically the bulk price of honey, which if you're buying a 5-gallon bucket like the question asked, is going to be around $2 to $2.50 a pound. Depending on how big of the producer is. So like I get a little bit of a premium because I'm a small local producer. Some of our big people, obviously we have, whether you think of it or not, we have producers here in the state of Iowa that have 10 to 20,000 beehives. So they're all over the state, so they can't really label it as a super local honey, and so obviously that'll be the cheapest. But if you look on Facebook anymore, like a pound of honey ranges anywhere from $5 to $10. It just kind of depends on what you're getting. Okay, and that's kind of leads into also I get questions about the color of honey and the taste of honey. And again, we can't control that flavor very well because we're always at the mercy of what's blooming at the time. So the nectar or the honey that I produce will change slightly from year to year because it really depends on what those bees are foraging on as to what shapes the flavor. And the same with the color. So we think about like a white clover honey. I mean, it's almost clear. It's super light in color. But if we have a different product like a buckwheat honey, that'll be as black as molasses, just super dark, and it almost has like a bitter flavor. But again, that has to be kind of a unique situation because you have to have a lot of buckwheat in one area to produce that kind of honey. Okay, great question. So that's kind of the end of my formal presentation there. If you feel more comfortable sending a chat, we can do questions that way. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, we can do it that way as well. Whatever you guys feel comfortable with. Otherwise, I think we're wrapping it up, but I'm happy to take as many questions as you guys got. Okay, so I have a question in the chat that said, if someone wants to get into raising bees, what do you recommend? The most important things is knowledge, right? So we think of bees as kind of easy to handle, easy things to do. Taking classes, very important. Reading lots of books, very important. And then what would be great if you can swing it is getting a mentor. One of the nice things about beekeeping is it seems like all the beekeepers, it's a very open environment. So if you ask someone, they're more than willing to tell you. There's not too many real trade secrets, so they'll just kind of lead you through that. So if you can find someone, that is your best bet, okay? So the question is, what's your opinion on hives in town? Are they safe? Well, you got to look at your different city ordinance. So different towns will have different rules. So I don't know where everybody is located. I know this is Marshall County, and that's pretty much all I know. But if you're interested in keeping bees in town, go to iowabeelaw.org. That's a product put on by the Iowa Honey Association. Basically, they contact every town with any kind of size to see what the rules are. You know, sometimes it's you can have, maybe they'll limit 1 or 2 hives. Sometimes you just can't be at commercial scale, which I don't know how they really do that. Others, you have to be so many feet away from a neighbor. But as far as, is it safe to have, so you'd have to do that first. That's step one. And then the next part of the question was, in my opinion, is it safe to have bees in town? Absolutely, I think so. You know, we think about a hive having this huge swarm of bees just like flowing out of it, and it's really not. Basically, as soon as they leave the hive, they'll just leave, right? So there's not really a cluster more than, say, 6-8 inches outside that entrance. And we all, you know, so again, I have bees right in my backyard. I have 3 little kids, and yeah, they're kind of used to it, but you know, the littlest one is still not quite 2. So, but yeah, we feel more than safe to have those bees there. And also, you know, you think about, you know, is it safe to have bees in town? Well, there are, even though there won't be necessarily honeybees, there's all different kinds of bees and wasps that are in town that you have to deal with. So they're just kind of there, you know, stinging insects are there all the time anyway, so it might as well be a beneficial that we can actually control. Okay, so the next question was, how much does it cost to set up a hive or 2? Again, it's kind of like any hobby where you can spend as much as you want or as little as you want. But basically, you're not going to get started even with a basic for your first hive for less than like $500. You're going to have about $200 to $300 in the hive equipment itself. Bees, you know, obviously you're going to have to buy some bees. So they'll range in price from $125 to $150, depending on what model or how you are buying them. We buy them either as packages or nucleus hives. So it just kind of depends on which way we go with that. And then past that, it's kind of sky's the limit as far as what kind of extraction system we're going to buy, what kind of bee suit we're going to buy, all that. So my basic rule of thumb is about $500, but it can go up from there, especially if we're talking about multiple hives. What is the benefit? One of the questions is, what is the benefit of registering your beehive? And how does a beehive impact corn and soybean production and spraying chemicals? Okay, that's a great question. We could do an entire presentation on that. The big thing is, so I always volunteer at the Iowa Honey Producers stand, and we always get people come up and be like, wow, you raise bees, so you must absolutely hate farmers, right? Well, obviously that's not the answer. That's not true. Especially me, here in this position I have at Iowa State, I work with farmers every single day. So it really is that kind of communication. So that's what the big deal is with registering your hive. So Iowa has what's known as the Iowa Bee Law, and it is law that you are not allowed to spray if you're being paid to spray. So if the co-op is spraying it for you, or if you are a private person who sprays neighbors for a fee, you're not allowed to spray a chemical that is listed as harmful to bees, toxic to bees, from the hours of 8 a.m. to the hours of 6 p.m. at night. So 8 a.m. in the morning, 6 p.m. at night. And the idea there is that's when bees are foraging, so that's when we can't spray. A private farmer, spraying his own field, he has the right to do that. That kind of gets sticky when it's a drift issue. But basically, if you don't have your bees registered, then it's not the farmer's fault to not know that they're there, okay? So they have to follow that rule if you're registered. We do, part of my position at Iowa State, we do a lot of, I do all the private applicator trainings throughout the state with our area agronomists. And we talk about the this registry all the time. So farmers have to be checking at the beginning of every month that they plan on spraying a chemical. And again, that's only chemicals listed as toxic to bees. So products like Roundup and 2,4-D, those are not listed as toxic to bees. Basically, your big ones are going to be your insecticides, right? So insecticides kill insects, bees are insects, so those are labeled toxic to bees. That's just kind of the rule of thumb. And again, that registry is not there to kind of pin people against each other. It's to open up that line of communication saying, hey, we have bees registered here. Here's how you get a hold of me, okay? What's the best way of protecting bees in the winter? So basically the big things we have to do is make sure they have a ton of food. So again, we just took honey off here, a few months ago, but bees need about 100 pounds of feed to make it through the winter. So we got to so a lot of people will feed back a sugar water product of some sort back to them to make sure they have food throughout the winter. We have to get the wind off of them, and those bees will produce a lot of moisture. So we have to have some way of wicking up that moisture. Those are the big keys to winter prep. Out of the wind, tons of feed, and then having some way of getting the moisture out of the bees. Does that rule of thumb, okay, so the question is, does the rule apply to applying chemicals in town? Okay, so this is kind of a sticky question, but it's a great question. I have been on the phone with our Department of Ag and our Pesticide Bureau, and they don't have a clear answer on that. And as a beekeeper and someone who works with pesticides all the time, I find that kind of unacceptable. My big question was like towns that fog or companies that fog for mosquitoes. How does that work with registered beehives? And basically I didn't get a real clear-cut answer, so I can't give you a real clear-cut answer. But obviously, those are chemicals that we're applying that can have a toxic effect on bees, right? So, your other products that you're applying to your yard, depending on what we're doing, if you're spot spraying some glyphosate, or you're doing 2,4-D in your yard. Again, those aren't labeled as toxic to bees. So technically, no matter what, you would not be out of compliance. And if you're doing it yourself, you'd be a private owner, so you would not be out of compliance. But from kind of a stewardship thing that I have to talk about because of my position here at Iowa State, do you have to spray? We're all worried about pollinators and things. So, some of those key crops that we as people who manage hives rely on are dandelions and Dutch white clover. And that's exactly what you're spraying out of your yard. So from a beekeeper standpoint, go ahead and leave those beautiful white and yellow flowers in your yard for us, because we'll take advantage of them. I think okay, I think one of the questions is there any factors that influence the antimicrobial properties of the honeybees that the honeybees produce? Or is it the same no matter what, as long as the honey is unpasteurized? Well, the main reason that honey is antimicrobial is because there's so much sugar in it. It's packed in there. So if we think about like salting pork, right? That's what kind of made it safer to eat, is you're just taking away that environment of something getting in there. Okay, so like you can put honey as a antiseptic on a cut or a wound, and again, it's mostly because that is an environment that microbes just cannot live in, because there's so much sugar in there that there's a lack of oxygen and things in there. So that kind of goes back to making sure that is really dry, that 18.5%, because if I were to harvest honey that was too wet and throw it in a bucket and sell it to you, it would start to ferment, okay? Because again, that the natural yeast in the air and stuff will get in there, and it'll start to ferment, which makes like a mead, right? Which is the original alcohol, because that's, I'm sure, exactly what happened. It mixed with water, it diluted out those sugars just enough that microbes were able to start growing in there. How much honey does a hive produce? In regard to a family use, or is it way more? Oh, yeah. So like I said, in Iowa, the average hive will produce about 65 pounds of honey. So in case you didn't know, a 5-gallon bucket weighs about 60 pounds. So that's more than a 5-gallon bucket of pure liquid honey. And then, so that weighs 60 pounds. And the average American eats about a pound, pound and a half. So if you have 5 people, yeah, a bee will, or a hive will way outproduce you. And that's in the state of Iowa. Actually, our neighbors to the north in the Dakotas, they are the ones who can really crank out a lot of honey per hive. Their hives go over 200, 220 pounds per hive, which if you've ever driven through South Dakota, you just see these huge clusters of beehives after beehives after beehives. And again, their season is short, but they have a great foraging area, so, and great nectar producing plants, so they can really crank out per hive. I think that's all my questions. Someone, if I missed one, just resend it, because I don't know where I'm at in the lineup there, but I think that was all the questions. I think I answered them. Unless you got any other last ones, go ahead and throw a chat on there or unmute.
I don't see anything else coming in. So I don't remember if you did in the beginning, but do you want to tell them how to get a hold of you if they have more questions?
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you can shoot me an email. It's Z Koopman. It's my name there listed on the on my picture, ZKOPMAN at iowastate.edu. So go ahead and shoot me any emails you want on that. Be happy to lead you to the direction you need to go.
All right, well, thank you everybody for hopping on. It was a good presentation. Thanks for all of your questions, and I hope you guys enjoyed the evening. And if you are going to join us in the next 2 sessions, and one in November, one in December, you guys will get a reminder email for that as well. So thanks for joining, everybody.